All right, welcome to the Week 5 Forum. This week we are discussing dissident terrorism. Martin's opening paragraphs describes the career arc of a Uruguayan terrorist group from the 1960s known as the Tupamaros, who were young, idealistic, middle-class, self-styled Marxists who employed Carlos Marighell's urban guerrilla resistance tactics, which was calculated to goad the Uruguayan government into an overreaction. Um, how did the Uruguayan government react, and what does the fate of the Tupamaros suggest about repression, as a state tactic for dealing with terrorism? I should say repression. I think it's safe to say that dissident terrorist groups are frequently motivated by perceived injustices, but what are some of the other rationales employed by dissident groups to move from protests to the kinds of violence that are often characterized as terrorism? Um, when you look at the four groups of dissident terrorism that Martin discusses in this chapter, revolutionary, nihilist, nationalist, and criminal, are these categories mutually exclusive? How would you distinguish between a revolutionary and a nihilist group? What is the critical distinction between a revolutionary and a nationalist terrorist? How about the distinction between a nihilist and a criminal terrorist? I ask these questions because it's important to recognize that these are not always hard and fast, mutually exclusive categories. How does the U.S. government view foreign terrorist organizations? What does it take for the State Department to label an organization as an FTO, a foreign terrorist organization, in the country reports on terrorism? As Martin correctly notes, most terrorist groups are anti-state in nature, but that anti-state animus can be revolutionary, nihilist, nationalist, or criminal in nature. For example, the text notes the Palestine Liberation Army was certainly motivated by an anti-state, motivation, or animus vis-a-vis Israel. But they also had nationalist aspirations as well. Can you think of any other groups that have those kinds of mixed motivations? Um, Martin notes that a defining feature of most dissident terrorist groups is that why they willingly take on seemingly insurmountable odds is that they seem to have an unshakable faith in the inevitability of their ultimate victory. What explains these sorts of convictions? To what extent do these folks seem to be demonstrating a capacity for self-delusion? Is this a unifying feature of dissident terrorism? Does that provide us with an avenue towards understanding how to deconstruct this kind of radicalism? Martin notes that a considerable amount of terrorism takes place in developing countries and appears to be related often to ethnic and racial tensions, and oftentimes will have a communal component to it. When you look, for example, at the violence towards the Rohingya Muslim population in Myanmar, a lot of it has to do because the Rohingya were agitating for greater rights and more recognition in a country where the majority of citizens were Buddhists and where a fairly huge majority of Burmese, or whatever you call them, Myanmarians, view themselves as, they think that their country is Buddhist. So a lot of the attacks on the Rohingya were actually made by machete-wielding Buddhist monks who felt like giving Muslims a voice in the government would lead to their diminishment. So in many instances, what was happening in Myanmar was establishment terrorism, but in a lot of instances, it also had a communal flavor to it as well. The same thing happened, in the Central African country where the Hutus and Tutsis, found themselves, killing, actually where the Hutus were doing a lot of the killing of the Tutsis. There are a number of horrific instances of religious communal terrorism listed in this chapter, including the ethnic cleansing that took place in the 1990s in Yugoslavia and the long and bloody civil war that took place on the island of Sri Lanka between the Hindu Tamil minority and the Buddhist Sinhalese majority. Martin also discusses the new operational shifts that dissident terrorist groups are employing, which he categorizes as the new dissident terrorism. How is new terrorism distinct from the kinds of terrorism that emerged in the post-World War II era. The last thing I want to mention in giving you some guidance for this week's discussion is the increasing reliance of dissident groups on child soldiers. What are some of the social and political factors that lead dissident groups to arm, train, and deploy child soldiers into violent situations? What kinds of problems emerge when you give children guns and train them to kill? Can you deprogram children who have killed? What are the consequences of that? How much money does the state have to devote to dealing with that segment of their population in the aftermath of the Civil War? So hopefully I've given you plenty to think about and discuss for this week. If there's anything in this chapter that you don't understand or this week's discussion, please let me know in the forum and I will try to clear it up.